The oldest king list begins above humanity. I did not expect that sentence to be true in the literal, documentary sense that it is. I expected metaphor, later embroidery, priestly theatre layered over fragile dynasties trying to look older than they were. Instead, when I went back to the earliest formal records of kingship I could verify, I kept finding the same opening move. The ruler does not begin with himself or even with his father. He begins us by pointing somewhere higher, older, and outside the ordinary human line. In Mesopotamia, kingship descends from heaven. In Egypt, the official lists begin with gods before they reach men. In Japan, the imperial line is written back to Amaterasu. In Maya, political theology, rulers fasten themselves to first fathers and receive tokens of rule. The familiar summary is that this is all myth. And of course it is myth, but myth is not the part that unsettles me. The unsettling part is that these are state documents, court-sponsored chronicles, ritual texts, accession records, funerary programs, king lists. They are administrative memory. They are the places where civilizations tell us, as soberly as they know how, where authority comes from. And over again, authority does not begin on Earth. This is not obscure territory. The Weldblundel Prism, the most complete version of the Sumerian king list, sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford under accession number AN1923.444. Thorkild Jacobson's foundational study, published by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago in 1939, remains a standard scholarly point of entry. Egyptian king lists have been worked over for 2 centuries by epigraphers, up from the Palermo stone to the Turin king list in the Museo Egizio. Henri Frankfort, writing from what is now the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at Chicago, framed the difference cleanly. In Egypt, the king was not merely approved by the divine order, but was conceived as a god among men. In Mesoamerican studies, the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque has been examined by generations of scholars since Alberto Ruiz Luillier opened Pakal's tomb between 1949 and 1952. In Japanese historiography, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki are not fringe texts. They are the canonical foundations of early imperial ideology, studied through projects like Berkeley's Japanese Historical Text Initiative. Even the comparative language is mainstream. Scholars routinely discuss divine kingship, sacred descent, dynastic legitimation, ancestral cult, and mythic historiography. None of this is hidden, none of it is forbidden. The archives are open, the museums are public, the translations are online, and the institutions involved are among the most established in the world. The difficulty is not absence of data. It is what we choose not to do with it. The anomaly is simple enough to say and strangely difficult to absorb. The earliest formal traditions of kingship in multiple civilizations do not describe rule as a local invention worked out through trial, conquest, and custom. They describe it as something transmitted from a prior realm, handed down through a sanctioned line, and guarded by objects, titles, or rights that make that line visible. Mainstream scholarship acknowledges each instance separately. Mesopotamian specialists describe the ideological function of the king list. And Egyptologists note the mythological columns of the Turin canon. Maya scholars discuss ancestry and rebirth imagery. Historians of Japan speak openly about chronicles composed to sanctify imperial rule. The facts are not disputed. What is rarely pursued is the next question. Why does the same institutional grammar appear in cultures so distant from one another that direct borrowing in several cases is not available as an explanation? I want to stay with that for a moment. The first complete Mesopotamian king list does not begin with a king. It begins with kingship itself descending from heaven. That is not my paraphrase. That is the structure of the text. Before names, before dates, before cities rise and fall, a power appears first, and only then do rulers become possible. The standard explanation is not foolish. These are ideological texts. They naturalize power. They take unstable human succession and anchor it in cosmic order. I accept that. I think anyone serious has to accept it. But it does not finish the problem. Because once that concession is made, we are still left with official cultures repeatedly insisting that legitimate rule is not merely blessed by the gods, but genealogically connected to a first, sanctioned source beyond ordinary memory. That is more specific than generic piety. It is an architecture. It tells me that royal blood, royal office, and royal objects were imagined as parts of a single inherited package. And once I saw that, I found it difficult to unsee. As I discussed before in a previous piece on king lists and flood traditions, the most revealing data often sits in formulas scholars know so well they stop hearing them. This feels like one of those cases. Start in Mesopotamia, because the language there is brutally clear. On the Ashmolean prism, the text moves from the line, "after the flood had swept over," directly to "kingship had descended from heaven." Jacobson pushed the point further in 1939, when he argued that the Sumerian text treats kingship almost as an object, something that was carried from one city to another, not merely inherited abstractly. In his reading, the phrase is better translated not as rule simply passing, but as an inanimate thing physically transferred, closely tied to symbols such as crown and scepter. So the office is older than the man, detachable from the man and portable across geography. What exactly is being carried? And then there is the object itself. The Weld-Blundell prism is only about 20 centimetres high and 9 centimetres across, a baked clay prism with 4 narrow faces, each face cut into 2 columns of cuneiform. It is a small thing. That is what unsettles me first. The object that claims to preserve the transfer of sovereignty from heaven to earth is not monumental. It is hand-sized, perforated through the centre so it could once have been mounted on a peg, its edges slightly worn, its surface the colour of dried earth. Found probably at Larsa, presented to the Ashmolean by Herbert Weld-Blundell in 1923, it stands there now with the quiet confidence of an inventory item. Look at this if you can, because no description prepares you. You are looking at a compact administrative object that contains antediluvian rains, a flood boundary, and a theory of rulership that begins before history. What was this for? Egypt is not identical, but it is close in the way that matters. The Turin King List, a hieratic papyrus now reconstructed from roughly 300 fragments, preserves 11 columns of rulers and begins not with Narmer or Menes, but with the primordial period, listing gods, demigods, and spirits before the historical kings. The Palermo stone reaches backward as well. The first register preserves 9 predynastic rulers of Lower Egypt, and one scholarly estimate suggests the original line may have contained as many as 120 names. This is not folklore drifting at the edge of the archive. This is royal chronology, copied and recopied because chronology mattered. Why do official king lists keep refusing to start with humans before moving forward? But this deserves attention. In Turin, the back of a recycled papyrus records the sequence of kings from divine rule to mortal rule. In Palermo, a stone annal compresses predynastic memory into the same framework later used for pharaohs. 2 different media, 2 different histories of preservation, 1 solution to legitimacy. I want to sit with that before moving on. The Maya evidence comes at the problem from another angle, and I find that almost more important. In Alan Christensen's translation of the Popol Vuh, the Quiche founders travel eastward across the sea to Tulan-Zuiva, where they receive their titular gods and tokens of kingship. That line matters because it fuses genealogy, sacred objects, and political rite in a single event. Then, centuries later at Palenque, Pakal's sarcophagus turns lineage into stone. The sides of the sarcophagus show ancestral figures as trees emerging from the earth, and the tomb program binds Pakal's birth and death inscriptions to the images of his parents. A cycaduct rises from the sarcophagus toward the temple above. Royal blood is not presented as family pride. It is presented as a channel between worlds. Why are ancestors being used here as operating machinery rather than memory? Japan preserves the same logic in a more explicitly political register. The Japanese Historical Text Initiative states plainly that the first chapters of the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki focus on the myths of Amaterasu, the ancestress of Japan's long line of emperors and empresses, and that both chronicles were intended to sanctify and strengthen imperial rule. A modern study of the text goes further, and stating that the main concern of the Kojiki is to establish the divine origin and the continuity of the imperial lineage, after Emperor Tenmu complained in 682 that the existing records contained errors and falsehoods. Even here, where the editorial purpose is almost announced in advance, the solution is not just divine favour. It is corrected genealogy. It is bloodline repair. Why does legitimacy keep being solved by tracing a ruler back to one authorised beginning? The Inca material, though preserved through later colonial recording, pushes in the same direction. The Smithsonian's retelling of the Inca origin story, based on Garcilaso's royal commentaries, says Inti sent Manco Capac and Mama Oclo to found Cusco and bring order to humankind. Britannica is even more concise. Inti was believed to be the ancestor of the Incas and was represented as a gold disc with a human face raised in flames. There it is again, on another continent entirely. Rule is not local improvisation. It is descent from a solar source, then fixed in a state cult, then handed to a founder whose line becomes imperial memory. How many times does a pattern repeat before we stop calling it incidental? Now pull back. Mesopotamia says kingship descended from heaven and was carried from city to city. Egypt places divine and semi-divine rulers at the head of official chronology. The Maya bind political authority to first fathers, sacred tokens, and ancestor-mediated rebirth. Japan compiles state chronicles to stabilize an imperial descent line beginning with the solar deity. These are not vague parallels. This is the same vocabulary appearing independently. How does that happen? I do not think the answer is that every culture secretly remembered the same event in the same way. That would be too easy, and the evidence does not permit it. But I also do not think all states invent myths is remotely enough. States invent many things. They do not all invent the same institutional structure or the same insistence on first ancestors, sacred regalia, corrected lineages, and rule arriving from elsewhere. The similarity is not thematic. It is procedural. A throne is legitimized by proving continuity with a source that is older than ordinary humanity, and by placing that proof in durable media. Clay, papyrus, carved stone, court chronicle, tomb program. Take Egypt again. The Turin Papyrus does not merely remember divine rulers, and it organizes them in the same columnar logic used for later kings, as if transcendence belongs inside administration. Take the Maya again. The Popol Vuh does not merely tell a creation story, it links genealogies and land rights to a remembered sequence of founders and the moment they received tokens of rule. Which I have covered in a previous piece on royal tombs. Pakal's burial then turns that principle into architecture. Ancestry is not sited, it is built around the body. Take Japan. The very act of compiling the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki follows a political crisis over corrupted descent records, and the solution is a state-backed restoration of heavenly lineage. Different civilizations, same repair mechanism, and there's a physical pattern as well. Mesopotamia has the prism, and Egypt has the broken but persistent papyrus in Turin and the annal stone in Palermo. The Maya have the sarcophagus chamber under the Temple of the Inscriptions and the images of ancestors literally rooted into Pakal's coffin. Japan has chronicles anchored to imperial records and origin traditions, compiled at court for the direct purpose of sanctification. The Inca case adds the solar image itself, Inti rendered as a gold-faced disc at the centre of state worship. In every case, the claim is not left floating in oral memory alone. It is fixed into an object or a controlled text. That matters, because once a civilization decides to store the origin of kingship in curated matter, it is no longer speaking casually, it is preserving doctrine. There is another reason I keep returning to the comparison. And each of these traditions treats origin not as a story told once at the beginning and then forgotten, but as a mechanism that has to be reactivated whenever succession becomes unswapable. Mesopotamia uses the language of carried kingship. Egypt keeps divine rulers inside chronological bookkeeping. The Maya make ancestors function as conduits in death and accession. Japan compiles and recompiles descent when records are judged corrupt. The Inca imagine the founder dispatched with a civilizing mandate from the sun. These are systems for restarting legitimacy. That is why the pattern feels less like decoration and more like procedure. I understand why this has not been pursued more aggressively. Some of the reasons are entirely legitimate. Archaeology in Iraq has repeatedly been disrupted by the Iran-Iraq War, the 1991 Gulf War sanctions, the 2003 invasion, and years of insecurity that made long-term fieldwork extraordinarily difficult. Cuneiform studies are a swiggerless bottleneck even under ideal conditions. Egyptology has its own conservation burdens, fragmentary corpora, and institutional habits of dividing religious, historical and textual work into separate silos. In Turin, the king list spent 2 centuries in pieces, with restoration campaigns in 1834-1930, and then a major remounting only in 2022 under Miriam Crutch, supported through Museo Egizio's restoration framework and its Turin partners. These are real constraints, they matter. But they do not explain everything. The Weld-Blundell prism has been in Oxford since 1923, that is 103 years. According to Museo Egizio's own timeline, no complete edition of the Turin King List had appeared after Farina's 1938 publication, even though scholars kept adding notes and rearranging fragments. That is 88 years. Meanwhile, a 2024 Berkeley capstone on cuneiform translation could matter precisely because, in its phrasing, museums worldwide still hold over 500,000 untranslated tablets. The problem is not that no one cares. The problem is that the system rewards narrower questions. Publish the edition, publish the join, publish the linguistic fix, move on. Comparative curiosity becomes nobody's department. I am not describing a coordinated suppression. I am describing something more diffuse than that, and in some ways more troubling. A civilization can preserve a question perfectly and still decline to ask it. Museums can display the object, universities can teach the text. The specialists can acknowledge the anomaly inside their own field, and still the larger pattern can remain academically homeless. Too historical for myth studies, too mythic for political history, too comparative for area specialists, too strange for cautious funding panels. That kind of neglect leaves no fingerprints. It leaves shelves, catalogue numbers, and a silence that looks responsible until you notice how much it has trained us not to connect. And the publication history makes the point harsher, not softer. Jacobson's Sumerian King List is from 1939. Frankfurt's Kingship and the Gods is from 1948. Ruz opened Pakal's tomb in 1952. These are not recent discoveries waiting for time to mature. They are old enough to have formed schools, careers, and subfields. Yet the safest scholarly habit has been to treat each archive as culturally unique right up to the point where the shared structure becomes visible, and then to stop. I do not think that is malice. I think it is an ingrained professional reflex against overreach. But sometimes restraint becomes its own distortion, so I want to be very precise here. I'm not saying that every ancient royal house was biologically descended from a literal, non-human being. I am not claiming that the Sumerian King List, the Turin Canon, the Popol Vuh, and the Nihon Shoki are secretly reporting the same historical episode. I am not saying that mainstream scholars are hiding evidence they know to be true. What I am saying is that mainstream sources, read carefully and side by side, that show multiple civilizations formalizing the same idea. Legitimate kingship must be traced through a preserved line to a single sanctioned origin that precedes ordinary human rule. That observation is not speculative. It is already in the record. The only controversial part is noticing how often it appears. Why do official king lists in Mesopotamia and Egypt both place non-human rule at the head of chronological memory instead of outside it? What exactly were the tokens of kingship at Tulanzuiva in the Popol Vuh, and why are they presented as received rather than invented? The record does not tell us why Emperor Tenmu's concern with errors and falsehoods had to be solved by the restoring heavenly descent, and I find that absence harder to explain the longer I sit with it. Why is Pakal's body surrounded not simply by honours, but by a working genealogy of ancestors rendered as trees and linked to a psychoduct? What was being stabilised when the Turin King List placed gods, demigods, spirits and human rulers inside one continuous sequence? The Inca founder is sent by Inti to found Cusco. Why does imperial memory so often begin with mission rather than migration? Which element mattered more in these systems, blood, object or rite? The Weld-Blundell prism is small enough to hold in two hands, so why does an object of that scale carry a claim this large? Where exactly did ancient states learn that descent needed to point beyond humanity? Who first decided that sovereignty was something that came down? We still do not know the origin of the pattern, and that, finally, is the quietest part of this whole inquiry. Not that the texts are strange, not that ancient rulers wanted cosmic legitimacy, but that across such distance and difference they kept returning to the same administrative answer to the problem of power. The clay is still there in Oxford. The prism stands upright behind glass, its cuneiform wedges cut into four narrow faces, the old surface carrying more authority now than the men who once used it. I think about the scribe turning it slowly on its axis, reading city after city, reign after reign, until the whole list reaches backward beyond memory and calmly states that kingship arrived from above. I think about how many visitors glance at it as one artifact among many and move on before the sentence has time to take hold. Then I think about what it means that this object survived while empires did not. The papyrus in Turin broke into hundreds of fragments and was still reassembled because the sequence mattered. Pakal's tomb remained sealed beneath a pyramid until the 20th century and still spoke in the language of ancestral transmission. The Nihon Shoki still opens with the descendants of Amaterasu because political memory kept needing that beginning. Across continents, the same need kept returning, not just to rule, but to prove that rule belonged to a line already sanctioned before any living claimant was born. And so I end where I began, with the small baked prism from Lhasa, about 20 centimetres high, perforated through its centre, brown as dried river mud, carrying on its narrow faces a sequence of names broken by flood and resumed under heaven. It does not raise its voice, it does not argue, it simply remains year after year in the Ashmolean, insisting that the earliest memory of rule was not election, not conquest, not contract, but descent. If so many thrones begin by pointing upward to the same vanished origin, we are left staring at a lineage we still cannot name,